So it's been a few days since I've done a video. This is really a video I would have made at the time, but it simply wasn't possible. So I'll just say a few words about it now, but I am having some space issues at the moment. Some of you managed to get to my live stream earlier and we discussed this, but I think a video can still reach more people. I like live streams because it gives me an opportunity to interact directly with subscribers. But like I say, videos generally reach a bigger audience overall. Um, So without further ado, just a few words on what happened in Moscow. A terrible incident. It's a major terrorist attack. I think the biggest so far this year anywhere in the world, actually. My immediate thoughts were it really had echoes of what happened in Paris in 2015, the Bataclan theatre there. I believe this was called the Crocus Hall, and it was in a city uh, Kramagorsk, I believe the place is called, just outside Moscow. So Moscow has an extensive metropolitan area as well with satellite cities. This is one of the satellite cities, but in Moscow Oblast, which is a Russian subdivision. Um, Moscow's a city that's had no shortage of terrorist attacks, at least 4 or 5 major attacks in this millennium. Um, Back in 1999, there was apartment bombings in Moscow and other cities. Now, I have a book, um, Blowing Up Russia by Alexander Litvinenko and co-edited by Yuri Felshtinsky. And if you look closely, I may have shown this before, it's a bit hard to see with this camera, banned in Russia. Basically, Litvinenko, before he was poisoned, alleged that the FSB, the successor to the KGB, had a hand in those atrocities. The rationale being that it would then justify the Second Chechen War. The first thing Putin done as president when he took over from Yeltsin, basically on the 1st of January 2000, Yeltsin resigned on New Year's Eve, was to launch the Second Chechen War, or rather escalated. He had been prime minister under Yeltsin, he then of course became president. I wouldn't put anything past the Putin regime at all. Now, when this atrocity happened, immediately Russian nationalists were blaming Ukraine. Putin actually didn't say anything for the first few hours, nothing, no condolences to the victims, just nothing. Medvedev, because when we talk about a lot about Russia, it's always Putin, 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 and yes, Putin is, he's at the top, but there are other Russian hawks who shouldn't be exonerated. Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, was immediately blaming Ukraine, saying death for death, with zero evidence. On the same day as this attack, it's worth noting that the Russian state carried out sabotage of Ukraine's energy supplies. I believe it was the result of a strike. Millions left without power, making an already hard situation worse. Make no mistake about it, Russia has engaged in state terrorism against the Ukrainian people for years. Uh, that isn't whataboutery, it's just a fact. Of course, there's no justification for what happened in Moscow, and it's right that British officials condemned that. There is reports saying that the US had warned its citizens before this. Putin claimed that was stoking up animosity towards Russia. The question is, if Putin ignored, and the security forces there ignored warnings from Western sources, then that is extreme negligence. I recall in 2000, the Kursk submarine disaster, Britain and Norway offered assistance, and Putin, in his arrogance, refused it. It's possible that had Britain and Norway been allowed to help out, those men could have been saved. It was a major submarine tragedy. Now, ISIS has claimed responsibility. They often will take credit for large-scale terror attacks, but it does bear a lot of the hallmarks of an ISIS attack. I mentioned Paris. It's also similar to the Manchester Arena bombing of 2017. And going further back in Russia, the Moscow theatre siege, although this wasn't really a siege situation. Some men have actually been caught alive, which is unusual for an Islamist attack. They were badly beaten up, young men of Central Asian appearance. Apparently, they're all Tajiks, and they look very shaken up and scared. Whether they've been tortured, roughed up, They had marks on their face, whether this was in the ensuing fight with the security forces. I don't know exactly what happened in that hall or afterwards, but it's possible they were tortured. Um, and they were, talking Russian, and you could just see the interrogator sort of asking questions, gunmen around them, and they were. I imagine what will happen is there'll be some sort of show trial, and I would not at all put it past the FSB and Putin's regime to try and get these men to claim that Ukraine put them up to it or something like that. For anyone out there who thinks that Ukraine was behind this, think logically. Yes, Russia and Ukraine are bitter enemies, but would it make any sense for Ukraine to support a terrorist attack on Russian civilians when they are in a situation where they're looking at what Trump might do regarding support? When they're in a situation where they need all the support they could get, it would be absolutely nonsensical. It's just not something that would make sense in terms of a strategy. Military targets even would be more logical, but if you believe the Kremlin's propaganda, then Ukraine somehow inspired ISIS to attack Moscow. Well, ISIS and Islamist groups have long had Russia in their sights. If anything, it will be a reprisal for Putin's support of Assad. Now, that's no justification. All terrorism must be condemned. It's a bloody atrocity against civilians, but it may well be that. In 2016, Andrei Karlov, the Russian ambassador to Turkey, was assassinated in Istanbul, or Ankara, actually, I believe it was Ankara. Um, and the reason cited was Russia's support of the Syrian regime. Let's not forget that war has been incredibly costly. It's not entirely over. And there is deep anger in pockets of the Middle East for Russia's support of Assad. Um, there's not really much more to add. I expect we'll see some sort of show trial. Can't imagine they'll get a fair trial. I'm not saying I'm sympathetic to them, but with Putin's regime, you can never be entirely sure what's going on. Um, some people have said that they don't look like the men in the video footage. It's hard to know. I mean, if they've been tortured and roughed up, they're going to look different than when they've got the fatigues on. Um, if they're found guilty, and they are guilty, they absolutely should spend the rest of their life in prison. I know there's been calls for a return to the death penalty. It's kind of surprising it hasn't happened in Putin's Russia so far. Um, but yeah, it's an awful incident. It may well be that ISIS is once again on the rise. This particular group that claimed it was ISIS-K, which was also responsible for the Kabul airport massacre in 2021. So it's clearly a pretty dangerous organisation. I think Western cities will also be on high alert. But yeah, Moscow is no stranger to terrorism. It is the worst terrorist attack in Russia since the apartment bombings of 1999. I think it's now surpassed, well, excuse me, since the Beslin school siege of 2004, but the worst in Moscow since 1999. But yeah, it really doesn't surprise me that this was an Islamist attack. Russia has long-standing problems with that. Chechnya, unlikely, because Russia has actually pacified Chechnya and Ramzan Kadyrov is running the place. He's a Putin proxy. So the Second Chechen War was largely morphed into a low-level insurgency. The fact that Tajiks isn't overly surprising to me. It's not a part of the world that gets a lot of attention, but it's poor. It's rife for radicalization, and Russia is in their sights. Um, but yeah, the blaming of Ukraine is repugnant. Russia has engaged in state terrorism against Ukraine, against Ukrainian civilians, um, which is just as morally outrageous as what happened in Moscow, except on a much bigger scale.